Good evening, everybody. My name is Anat Admati. I'm a finance professor here at the GSB, and I'm the director of the CASI, the Corporation Society Initiative, which is a hybrid initiative powered by staff, including Tina sitting there, and student leaders, a number of whom are here. We have a change of guards with new MBA 1 leaders coming, including Nirali here, who might say a few words at the end. And this is our final event of the year, and we couldn't be more pleased than to host Karen Hao and Evan Epstein, who's going to moderate, to discuss this incredibly hot topic, which is about the governance of artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence, AGI, and especially the role of Sam Altman and OpenAI, a very much in the news corporation and person. Karen spoke today at an event at so-called HI, human-based source meant artificial intelligence here at Stanford. It was interesting. I went there, and then I interviewed her for something I record called Power to Truth, because that's what she and we are about. And I'm going to, without further ado, let Evan take it from here. Evan is a lecturer here and teaches corporate governance, and there's nothing more. We were just discussing this article called OpenAI's New Path to Conversion, meaning from a nonprofit to a for-profit control, faces activist opposition about the big battle in the courts and everywhere else. So take it from here. Evan, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation, Anat, and I'm very pleased to be talking about AI and talking to you about your book. It is the hottest thing in the Bay Area, in the United States, and you do an incredible job with your book of describing in detail what's going on. So first, I want to ask you, what inspired you to write this book, and how did you get started with it?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about my career first and how I ended up covering AI in the first place. So I was originally a mechanical engineer. I went to MIT for undergrad, and I thought I would work in the tech industry, never thought I would do journalism. And I ended up moving to San Francisco, like all of my fellow classmates when I graduated. I joined a startup. I did the Silicon Valley life for a year. I lasted a year in it before I hit upon this conclusion that I think has come to inform a lot of my work as a journalist, that ultimately the incentive structures within Silicon Valley do not facilitate the development of technology for the social benefit, for the public good. It is primarily to facilitate the development of technology that is going to make a profit. And if there is a social benefit mission, that's great, but it's secondary. And I realized...
This is pre-AI.
This is, well, yeah, this was in 2015, 2016, which technically AI was already around back then, but certainly it was pre-generative AI and this quest towards AGI. And I realized that the problems that I was most interested in, the reason why I studied engineering in the first place was I was interested in sustainability and climate change and developing technology as a tool for social change. How do we create products that will change people's behaviors in ways that will help mitigate the climate crisis? And those types of problems are not profitable problems. And so I couldn't really imagine continuing to exist within that specific technology development ecosystem and be able to do work on the problems that I was most interested in working on. And so I naively thought, well, if I don't use technology as my tool for social change, maybe I can use writing as my tool for social change, and that must mean I'm a journalist. And so I switched into journalism. And it turns out, even though the logic was a little bit naive, that it ended up being the perfect place for me. And I started covering tech and covering the challenges around the tech industry and the incentive misalignments that I saw, and then specialized in AI starting in 2018. And it was when in 2018, I joined MIT Technology Review. That's how I started covering AI. And Tech Review at the time, still, it very much focuses on emerging research, technology that doesn't necessarily have commercialization around it. And OpenAI was originally founded as a nonprofit to be a fundamental AI research lab with no intention of commercialization. And so it was squarely on my beat. And so that's what led me to have the nonprofit on my radar. And in 2018, 2019, there was a series of changes at OpenAI that many people are probably familiar with now, which is that they then nested a for-profit within their nonprofit, speaking of corporate governance.
So let's go into the beginning, because I think it's interesting to talk about the origin story of OpenAI, nonprofit. Tell us a little bit how that got started. Elon Musk at the beginning, the Manhattan of AI project, or whatever it was called at the time. Maybe how it has evolved from there to the current iteration, which even today, as Anat was saying, there's been a legal challenge to its restructuring.
Yeah, so the origin of OpenAI it was co-founded by Sam Altman and Elon Musk, and it was originally an idea that Altman hatched when he was still the president of YC, Y Combinator. And he, I think, identified as someone who was quite strategic in figuring out how to place himself at the epicenter of hot activity. He identified AI as a next wave that he wanted to be part of. So he wanted to create an AI lab within YC, actually. That was originally the conception. He understood that in order to do that, he needed to recruit a lot of talent, top talent in AI research. And he didn't necessarily have a lot of AI expertise or name recognition within the AI world, but Elon Musk did. And so he went about recruiting Musk to his endeavor, and Musk at the time was going on this public education campaign where he was talking constantly and incessantly about this idea that AI could potentially destroy all of humanity. He called to AI unleashing the demon, and was advocating for regulation, careful control of AI development, and specifically harbored this thing against Google, because Google had a monopoly on AI talent, and Musk said, I'm really, really, really worried about AI being developed in a for-profit environment. So Altman goes to recruit Musk saying, I share all of your concerns. What do you think about creating a nonprofit to counter Google? So we will create this nonprofit without any for-profit intentions and be able to develop AI purely for the public interest. Musk really liked that idea. They joined the project, they co-founded this nonprofit, and then they started recruiting researchers who specifically joined the project because Musk was on board. Fast forward 1.5 years, OpenAI hasn't, so at that point it was 2017, OpenAI hadn't really made a lot of progress because they didn't really have a plan when they originally started. They just had an idea, let's create this AI lab. And so they came to develop a plan specifically for how do we become a leader in AI development? How do we become number one? And they hit upon a specific approach, a thesis for AI development, which was let's just take all of the techniques that we have today and aggressively scale it, throw more data than we've ever seen before at training these software called neural networks, use larger supercomputers than have ever been built before to train these systems, and just see what happens, see if it gets us more powerful systems. And if we do that faster than anyone else, then we will get to number one. And so suddenly, the bottleneck shifted from talent to capital. And they realized that having a nonprofit no longer worked for raising the amount of capital that they anticipated, which was in the order of tens of billions. And that's when they nested the for-profit within the nonprofit as a fundraising vehicle to bring in private VC money, so that they could promise these investors some kind of return on their investment. And originally they called it a capped profit. So it was a for-profit that would cap the amount of investment that returned to the initial batch of investors. So the first batch, their investment, their return was capped at 100-fold what they put in. And then later on, it was 20-fold and then 6-fold. But that was the original intention.
So this is obviously a super unusual structure. Typically, startups don't have a nonprofit, or at least don't convert into a for-profit. Give us a little bit of the sense of the rift between Musk and Sam Altman at the beginning, because you describe how both wanted to take control, become CEOs, and they're still fighting over this, and there's litigation around this. But give us a sense of that moment where they decide to go alone. And at the time, there was a discussion among the founders to go with Elon and not Sam. So I think it's an interesting story.
Yeah, so when they hit upon this idea, we need some kind of for-profit vehicle. Originally, the idea was not, let's nest it within the nonprofit. They were just thinking, what if we convert this into a public benefit corporation, which is funny because now they then most recently tried to redo this conversion. So history comes full circle. But the problem was they then needed to name in the legal documents who's the CEO. And both Altman and Musk each wanted to be the CEO of this new for-profit entity, and they could not agree. The two other co-founders, one was serving as the chief technology officer, Greg Brockman. The other was chief scientist, Ilya Sutskever. They actually initially chose Musk. They thought that Musk had more name recognition, would have more influence and power and strategy and clarity to usher OpenAI down a path that they believed in. And Altman essentially used his personal relationship with Brockman to appeal to him and say, do you really think Musk is trustworthy? Do you really think that if AI is this all-powerful technology that it should be controlled by this other guy? How can you do this to me, your close friend? Why don't you see my ability to lead this endeavor? And Brockman got very quickly convinced, and then Brockman and Sutskever at the time were quite close because they had gone through the journey of creating the company together, and so then Brockman whispers in Sutskever's ear, and Sutskever eventually also decides, okay, let's choose Altman instead of Musk. And at that point, Musk was like, I don't want to be part of it anymore. If I'm not the CEO, if I'm not controlling this, and it's now turning from a nonprofit to a for-profit, then I'm out. And so he steps off as co-chairman. But for years, he actually continued to play a role in that he then installed one of his deputies from Neuralink, Siobhan Zilis, to be on OpenAI's board and continue to be a conduit and feed him information, and that Siobhan stayed for many years.
Okay, and I think what's interesting is your concept of empire of AI. Why is it called empire of AI, and what's your thesis behind this word?
So the title of the book is a nod to this argument that I make that these companies, like OpenAI, need to be understood now as new forms of empire. And the reason is because empires of AI, as I call them, have all the same characteristics as empires of old. They lay claim to resources that are not their own, and they redesign or reinterpret rules to suggest that it's always been their own. So that's referring to, the data that they scrape from the internet. Companies argue it's publicly available, and therefore we should be able to take it. It's in the public domain. But of course, many people who put their data on the internet did not do it with the informed consent of having that taken to train AI models that ultimately might limit their future economic opportunity. Empires also exploit a lot of labor. So OpenAI, they were contracting and still contract workers around the world, originally in the global south, to do things like data annotation, data labeling, content moderation of their products in very, very exploitative conditions where they're paid $2 an hour to do extremely psychologically toxic work. They're also labor exploitative in the sense that OpenAI's definition of AGI is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. So their explicit stated intention is to create labor automating machines. And so not only is the development, the supply chain of this AI development leading to labor exploitation, also the result of that AI development is intended to exploit labor. The third feature of empires is that they monopolize knowledge production. So one of the things that's happened over the last 10 years is these companies are so resource rich that they are able to hire all of the top AI researchers in the world. And so we've seen a dramatic shift from AI researchers predominantly working in academia or other independently funded institutions to primarily either working in or being funded by these AI companies. And so most of the AI research that's produced today, which is the bedrock of public understanding of how this technology works and what its limitations are, is filtered through what is good and not good for the companies, what is good and not good for the empire. And the last feature of empire building is there's always this narrative that there's a good empire and there are evil empires. And the justification for why the good empire needs to be an empire in the first place and do all of this resource extraction, all of this labor exploitation, is to make themselves strong enough to beat the evil empire. And they conceive of themselves as good because they have a civilizing mission, this idea that ultimately they're going to create something that will bring progress and modernity to all of humanity, and that will actually allow humanity to prosper rather than go to heaven rather than go to hell.
I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I want to ask you, what does it mean that they have this benefit to humanity, and how do you interpret that meaning? Because, you know, they say their fiduciary duty is to humanity as a whole, which is a completely, it means nothing in legal terms, but I want to ask you, how do you perceive that mission originally, and how has it evolved?
How did I perceive it originally? Well, you know, when I first started covering OpenAI, I had skepticism because I was skeptical of any company that uses that kind of highfalutin language. But also, I did think that there's something beautiful about saying we really want to develop technology for the benefit of all of humanity. Like, if you take that idea really, really, really seriously, it is something we should all aspire to, you know? But, of course, what I conclude in the book by my epilogue is that this very particular mission that OpenAI had is so... it lacks clarity, it lacks definition to the point where I think it has become the narrative empire-building tool. Because the full OpenAI mission is to ensure AGI benefits all of humanity. They cannot, to this day, within OpenAI, there's no agreement on what the phrase "to ensure" means, there's no agreement on what AGI is, and there's no agreement on what benefit to all of humanity is. So there's no agreement on any part of this mission. And so ultimately, the mission is interpreted and reinterpreted again and again and again and again, both by employees and by executives based on everyone's own conception of what they want to do. So it's almost a mirror that anyone can hold up within the organization and say, ultimately, I'm doing what I'm doing for the benefit of all of humanity. And it's just post-rationalization of what they wanted to do in the first place.
Well, there was a moment in time where this backfired, which is when Sam Altman got fired by the board. And this was a big moment in Silicon Valley because you had the hottest startup in the land that suddenly, on a Friday, he gets ousted by the board. And the backlash was, in 5 days, enormous, not only from employees, but a lot of people in Silicon Valley saying this is the biggest ouster since Steve Jobs in 1985 or whatever. Tell us about that story. You write about the ouster. What do you think the board had in mind? Why the board decided at the moment to fire Sam Altman? They made a statement which is, we have lost confidence in him. But in your reporting, what did you find, and what did you make out of the pushback out of employees and others in Silicon Valley?
It's a really complicated and long-winded answer, so I'll try to be succinct. But there were two forces at play that led to the board crisis. One is this, what I call a quasi-religious ideological clash that is happening within the AI world between two different factions called the boomers and the doomers. Boomers believe that AGI is going to bring utopia. Doomers believe AGI is going to kill all of humanity. I consider them two sides of the same coin in that ultimately they believe fervently in the idea that it is possible to recreate human intelligence. We don't actually have any scientific evidence that that is possible. It is a belief, and they themselves talk about it as a belief. And that if you believe that, this will lead to civilizational transformation, and that is why they conclude they need to be the one to carefully control the development of this technology. That was one force where within the history of OpenAI, there's always been these two different factions clashing with one another. And at the time when Altman was fired, the board was more doomer-leaning, and OpenAI was exhibiting more boomer-leaning behaviors, and Altman especially was exhibiting more boomer-leaning behaviors. And so there was this deep-seated concern, not just with the board, but with executives as well, that typical behaviors that might seem somewhat normalized within Silicon Valley. So the other force was that Altman is has a loose relationship with the truth. And a lot of Silicon Valley executives have a loose relationship with the truth.
Relationship with the truth.
But if you believe that the stakes are potentially the difference between bringing humanity to utopia or to devastation, the things that might be normalized, the behaviors that might seem acceptable or at least manageable in a typical Silicon Valley startup suddenly become extremely consequential. And so what happened was the board, by a series of accidents, started learning that Altman was not telling the truth about certain things. One of them being that OpenAI's startup fund, which was called OpenAI Startup Fund, a vehicle that it had started to invest in startups that would use OpenAI's technology, was actually owned by Altman. They learned that there were all these things Altman was saying was happening within the company about, we have all these phenomenal safety checks in place and everything is going smoothly and swimmingly, that actually a number of safety checks had been skipped. Specifically, Altman was constantly trying to skip them, and there was also a lot of chaos happening at the company because post-ChatGPT, the company had to scale aggressively faster than any organization in Silicon Valley history to support the hundreds of millions of users that were suddenly coming onto their service. And at the same time as the board was having these concerns, there were two executives that approached the board independently with their own versions of the same exact concerns. One was Ilya Sutskever, and the other one was Mira Murati, who replaced Greg Brockman as chief technology officer. Greg Brockman then became president.
Although Ilya was on the board.
Ilya was on the board, yes. So the independent board directors were having these realizations, and then Ilya, as both executive and a non-independent board member, came with serious concerns, in part also because he was also more doomer-leaning, and he was like, this escalates to a severe degree, a serious degree of severity. And Mira Murati, she wasn't necessarily doomer-leaning or boomer-leaning, but she just really believed in having good corporate governance, and she was getting very worried about how Altman was constantly trying to skip over a lot of mechanisms that had been put in place for that good governance. And so she was also escalating these concerns. And then Ilya and Mira then started coordinating with one another and comparing notes and consolidating different examples that they were finding of ways in which they really were deeply concerned about Altman's behavior. And then Sutskever was the one that recommended to the independent directors, I don't think this problem is going to be solved unless Sam is gone. And the board, after hearing that and reflecting on the same concerns, they decided Sutskever is right after lots of intense discussion, and that's when they fired him.
To me, this is like a very clean version of governance versus economics, because at the time, there was a tender offer for shares. The employees were going to tender at, $86 billion at the time. Mm-hmm. And that weekend, all the employees sided with Sam Altman, in part because they knew there was a tender offer and maybe they wanted to side with him. But also, it shows Sam Altman having a lot of relationships within Silicon Valley, a lot of executives, and the investors didn't have any rights. And so you had Microsoft and everybody else trying to save the company, but Microsoft very savvily almost got the company for zero, saying, hey, come over to Microsoft and we'll continue. What did you think about the approach of Microsoft, the investors, post the return of Sam Altman, and thinking about the reconversion of the company in the new direction that they had?
After Sam Altman retired. I mean, the investors were very clearly, they realized, wait a minute, this doesn't work in our favor. We can't just have a nonprofit board that, acted in their broad authority. There was an investigation, and then the investigation concluded the board actually did act within their broad authority. And Altman was one of the people that drafted that very broad authority when he originally formed the company, the nonprofit. But investors have really been pushing since then to change that, because, after going through that experience where you put tens of billions of dollars into something that might magically go poof. And funnily enough, when you invest in OpenAI, there's this giant purple box that investors get on their documents at the top that says your investment could go to zero at any moment because of our unique corporate governance structure.
Treat this as a donation. Oh, yeah. So it's like, you're investing $10 billion, but take it as a donation.
Yeah, but obviously investors were not operating under that assumption, because that's not what Altman would pitch to them when he was raising money. He would pitch the idea that it was an investment and it would be safe and they would reap lots of rewards from putting their money into an extremely hot and rapidly accelerating startup that was still in the lead for the next revolution of AI commercialization. And so they have been persistently, since the Altman's reinstatement, trying to get Altman to restructure the company to just be a company, just be a for-profit, have the nonprofit exist but not govern the for-profit, and have a for-profit board so that there is actual legal fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, to investors.
The interesting part as well is the departure of a lot of the leading figures, the co-founders. What do you make out of Dario Amodei starting Anthropic and Mira Murati and everybody else? What is the personal relationship and why did everybody leave? I mean, what is the part of the story that you make out of this egos or at least personality fights?
I think it's both ego and personality clashes and ideological clashes. I think many of the executives at OpenAI, former executives, most of them have left now, they understood or they identified that being able to shape AI is going to give them profound influence in our future society. But they all have disagreements about how to shape AI. And when they were aligned with Altman, they thought that OpenAI was the best place that they could be doing that shaping of the technology. But when they clashed with Altman on ideological grounds, they then splintered off to create their own organization because they thought the best way to try and manifest their vision of what they wanted AI to be was to create another company to compete with OpenAI and try and beat them in the market. And that's why we've seen Elon Musk leave and create xAI, Dario Amodei leave, create Anthropic, Ilya Sutskever leave, create SSI, Mira Murati leave to create Thinking Machines Lab. I mean, it's literally just a slew of departures, all reaching the same conclusion of, wait a minute, I want AI to be in my image. I want AI to be based on what I think is right. And now let me do exactly what Altman did in the beginning, which is try and form a company that is an extension of my will.
In governance terms, what's interesting is all of these companies are public benefit corporations. That's something completely new that never before startups were public benefit corporations. And, it's not only about shareholder value, but they espouse this fiduciary duty to humanity. And I think that's interesting. But when you talk about doomers and boomers, and they say, we're going to do this for the benefit of humanity, on the other side, there's a huge geopolitical fight. And it's US versus China. And if you don't like what we're doing, you won't like the Chinese version of this.
The good empire and the evil empire.
Right. Can you talk about the development of AI in China and, what are the guardrails or the different guardrails that they have? Obviously, the benefit of humanity is not something they espouse, but give us a little bit of...
They do, by the way.
They do?
Yeah. Every
wow.
Every empire espouses that they're doing things for the benefit of humanity. No one ever thinks of themselves as the bad guy.
Okay.
Everyone is always doing things for the benefit of humanity. Yeah, so the thing that people often don't really realize about Chinese AI development is that China's actually regulating AI very heavily. The most common rhetoric within the US about China is, well, they're not going to regulate anything and there's not going to be any guardrails whatsoever. And actually, China is the second to the EU, the one that has implemented the most amount of AI legislation and regulation, including, and I define it also broadly, it's not just regulating AI applications, they also have a data privacy law, for example, and they have cybersecurity laws and very robust ones that ultimately the AI laws and legislations now rest upon. And the same way that the EU has GDPR, has a data privacy legislation, and then they created the EU AI Act in part also calling upon some of the governance structures that they already, the scaffolding that they already laid in GDPR. And the US still doesn't have federal data privacy law, and so we aren't anywhere remotely close to implementing some kind of AI law because there is no scaffolding for that kind of framework. And actually recently, literally right now, there's a tax bill that's been going through Congress that just passed the House where Republicans inserted a clause to put a 10-year moratorium on AI regulation at the state level, and it's now going up to the Senate. Passed the House, going up to the Senate, and if it passes the Senate, there will literally be, in legislation, no ability to implement AI regulation at the state level for a decade. And so, so companies in the US will always evoke this what about China card when they want to ward off regulation. A key flaw in their argument is that China actually is already regulating these things. And Silicon Valley, if we take stock of what has this what about China card has actually gotten us over the last decade, I would argue that it hasn't gotten us any more democratic technologies. It's actually gotten us the reverse. We've just gotten more authoritarian technologies. And I write for a publication, I write for The Atlantic, and the executive editor at The Atlantic says we need to call these companies what they are. They're techno-authoritarians. They don't actually ask anyone participation in how to develop their platforms. They don't actually ask where these technologies should be deployed. And so we have seen the slow unraveling of liberalism around the world at the hands of Silicon Valley companies. And we need to realize that if we want to actually create more democratic AI, it's not about just ripping off all the guardrails. It's actually implementing more of them.
Yeah, I mean, this is a much broader, this is more an Anat's field of corporations and society, and it's a little bit of the vision of what is the role of corporations in society. But you touch on a topic of scale at all costs. Silicon Valley is famous for move fast and break things, and then you keep going. In this case, the rate of scaling is off the charts. And we are seeing announcements of $500 billion, the Stargate project. And, how do you think about the scale at all costs? And you think that's exactly the card that they're playing? And you are not a very good, or at least you're not very optimistic that it's going to end well.
No, I don't think it's going to end well because it's not going well right now, the scaling at all costs. And so one of the things that I highlight in the book is I'm not a critic of all AI. I think there are some wonderful AI technologies. AI is such a huge umbrella of technologies, and there are many AI tools that can be very beneficial. The thing I specifically critique is Silicon Valley's vision of AI development, which is this scale at all costs. And right now, based on the current projection of how rapidly and aggressively they're scaling and how rapidly and aggressively they need to expand their computing infrastructure, McKinsey just came out with a report saying in the next 5 years, there would need to be 2 to 6 times the amount of energy demand of the entire state of California added to the global grid to support that in the next 5 years. And Sam Altman just said in his most previous Senate testimony that this will most probably be serviced by natural gas. And what he's really saying is this will definitely need to be powered in part by fossil fuels. And there's already plenty of reporting by journalists documenting the fact that this data center expansion is leading, for example, to the extension of coal plants. Coal plants were supposed to be retired. They're no longer being retired. XAI is training Grok, their chatbot, on a supercomputer called Colossus built in Memphis, Tennessee. That supercomputer is currently being powered by 36 unlicensed methane gas power plants that are pumping thousands of tons of air pollution into the community. So this is what I mean by scale at all costs is not leading us to a good place because it's literally not doing good things right now. And if we extrapolate what's happening now into the future and add more zeros onto it, we're going to end up in a horrible end state.
So what would be your approach to ethically developing AI? And if somebody gave you, Karen, like this idea of, okay, let's build Silicon Valley in a better way, what would be your regulation or your vision of AI development?
I really want there to be more participatory AI development. And I think about the full supply chain of AI development when I say that. There are all of these different ingredients that go into developing AI, and there's also all these spaces in which AI then is deployed. And these ingredients in these spaces, they're collectively owned. So the data that these models are trained on, that data is either individually owned. There are people whose intellectual property has been taken to train these models who have not been able to opt in or opt out. And now they're suing these companies as a way to try and reclaim ownership over that data. But that could have been mitigated by these companies just saying, let's have a public discussion about what data we should use to train these models. Like I write in the book, there's a specific example I point to. I mean, throughout OpenAI's history, they make a lot of decisions about what data goes into these models completely by themselves, right? They don't consult with the public. They also don't consult with experts outside of their specific domains. And one of the key decisions they had early on was, should we train our image generators on pornographic imagery? And then they decided, yes, we should, because it's representative of the human experience. And that specific decision that they made has tons of downstream consequences, not least of which is that now these models can generate synthetic child sexual abuse material, because you don't actually have to train these systems on child sexual abuse material. You just have to train them on children, images of children, and then images of pornography, and out can spit child pornography. And that was, that's a decision that should have been a collective discussion. Same with where data centers are put in communities.
So you're basically saying boomers prevailed over the doomers in these decisions to scale?
No, because I don't think so one of the conclusions that I have in the book is boomers and doomers worked hand in hand to create this scale at all costs paradigm. Because both of them engaged in this rhetoric of, we need to scale at all costs so that we maintain the lead and control of this technology. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about the doomer ideology, I mean, there's sub-factions of the doomer ideology now, but Dario Amodei, who was the doomer that in the early days of OpenAI, he specifically said, we need to scale this as fast as possible, but then not release the model so that we can do research on it. But what actually happened was they scaled it as fast as possible, and then him and Altman butted heads, and Altman released it into the world. So if you look at the track record of what doomers have accomplished with their ideology, it has been persistently to continue accelerating the technology, even though they say that they stand for something different. And so, yeah, that's why I say two sides of the same coin.
So if we project 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what is your biggest hope and your biggest fear in terms of AI?
My biggest hope is that there's never been so many people talking about AI. When I used to cover it in 2018, people were like, wow, that's a really niche beat. Do you have enough to write about? And now, I mean, everyone is thinking about this, and I think that is amazing, because we need everyone to be thinking about it and to be specifically thinking about what is the active role that I can take in shaping this technology. I really do believe that everyone has a role, whether that is like the writers suing the companies, or whether that is activists resisting data centers, or whether that is teachers and students having serious discussions about how do we actually deploy AI into our environment in a way that enhances critical thinking instead of just eroding it away. And my hope is that through all of that discussion, we will get to a version of AI that is much more broadly beneficial, because there will be so much public discourse and governance finally out in the open of how we develop these tools. I should have done this the other way around and ended on the hopeful thing. But the worst case scenario for me is originally when I started this book, I was thinking more about vertical harms. I was thinking, I want to illustrate the supply chain and show people that digital technologies have a physical supply chain, that there are people involved, because that's not really commonly thought about. And I was thinking, okay, labor exploitation, that is one vertical harm. Environmental harms, that's another vertical harm. I'm going to illustrate those. What I realized was when I was talking to the people, the workers who were exploited, or the people whose environment was their resources were being extracted, they were saying the same exact thing, which is this sense of a complete loss of agency over the ability to self-determine their future. And that's when I realized that the greatest threat of these empires is the erosion of democracy. Because if the majority of people in the world start to feel like they don't have agency to self-determine, democracy doesn't work anymore. Because democracy is based on the idea that we all have a right, we all have a voice, we all deserve to go to that voting booth and say and feel we had that say to shape a collective future. And I'm seeing more and more in the current political environment, many people saying now, I don't even think my vote matters. I don't even know what I can do anymore. I should just lay down and give up, And that is when democracy dies, is when people give up like that. And so ultimately, I wrote the book with the hope that it could be a platform for motivating people to recognize, actually don't give up, because all of these ingredients that go into AI, all of these spaces in which AI deployed are collectively owned. And if we just remember to assert our ownership over that, we will be able to shape and change the trajectory of AI development.
All right. I think we can open it up for questions. I know there's a lot of people here, so whomever wants to take the first question. Right, in the back. Is there a microphone?
No, I think we have good
audio. Oh, good audio, okay.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. You painted, the idealistic world, what would be your North Star and your vision. How do we get there in the practical world, especially in the world where so many of these decisions are controlled by a very small handful of individuals?
Yeah, one of the stories that I highlight that I really loved in the book is this group of Chilean water activists who they were fighting tooth and nail to block data centers from entering their community. And Chile has a very interesting history that Evan knows well.
I know, I'm from Chile, so I can attest.
It was under dictatorship for a very long time, and there were a lot of public goods that became privatized, including water. Water is privatized in Chile, except for this one community in the greater Santiago metropolitan region that still retains a public freshwater supply that they use, and then in emergency situations around the country, that freshwater supply also gets wheeled out for addressing those emergency situations. And Google decided to pick that exact community to plan a data center that would take all of their fresh water. And that community was like, no, this is our fresh water. What are you going to give us in return for taking that fresh water? Are you going to give us more jobs? Are you going to give us a say in how this technology is developed, how it will ultimately influence us? Are you going to give us better internet from hosting this data center? Until you say something that is worth listening to, we will make trouble and not allow this data center to move forward. And so they canvassed on the streets, they knocked every single one of their neighbors' doors, they handed out flyers, they put up posters, they went to City Hall, they made so much noise that they blocked this data center from being developed for 5 years. To this day, the data center still has not been able to start construction. And it forced the Chilean government and Google representatives from Google headquarters to finally come to a table and listen to the community residents about what they actually wanted in exchange for a data center. Do they want the data center at all? Could they maybe host the data center under certain conditions? Like they forced that conversation, that dialogue, and it's still ongoing now. The Chilean government now has a roundtable where they engage with many different community groups, not just that one, but all across Chile, with different communities that are all potentially going to host data centers. And they have to regularly talk with this roundtable for any kind of data center development that happens in the country now. And I thought that was the most incredible example to remind us of what can actually be achieved when you first remember that these resources that these companies need are actually collectively owned, and when you assert that collective ownership. And I think in the US or anywhere around the world, we need to do that, take that spirit, take that lesson, and essentially amplify it 100,000-fold all across the AI development supply chain.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. Two very quick questions. I think one is around like alignment faking. Just if you kind of talk a little bit about that, where we're at now. I think recently there was news about AI basically threatening an engineer to expose an affair for the AI to achieve its aims. I think that's a really interesting place that we're at. But then also, are we at this point in which like the technology is actually developing us rather than us developing the technology? Because you just can't really stop now. And some of the rhetoric that's used is if we don't get there first, others will get there first, and then what that'll mean for national security, et cetera. If you could just kind of expand on that.
Yeah, the second part of your question is really interesting because this is an observation that has been made for decades. There was this really famous researcher, Joseph Weizenbaum, professor at MIT, who was actually the inventor of the first ever chatbot, Eliza, in the 1960s. And he invented Eliza. It essentially worked like ChatGPT, except that you typed in a typewriter and it was plugged into a mainframe the size of this room. And he actually invented it specifically to show that these systems are a mirage. And I think this will relate to the first part of your question as well. But he wanted to show that language is particularly alluring, and there's something about the human psychology that is uniquely vulnerable to believing in associating consciousness with things that appear to speak to us. And it was a social experiment. He was going to build this thing, get everyone excited about it, and then reveal the conceit, like reveal, surprise, it was actually just smoke and mirrors. And it turned out that his conceit was so good that even when he revealed, hey, it's all smoke and mirrors, no one believed him anymore. They all thought that human intelligence had been recreated and that we were going to no longer need human teachers, no longer need human doctors, no longer need human therapists. I mean, all this rhetoric we're now hearing the repetition of. And so he wrote this book called Computer Power and Human Reasoning that even back then, he explicitly stated that one of the threats of trying to recreate, specifically try and recreate human intelligence, basically try and replicate, instead of accepting that humans have some strengths and computers have other strengths, and then just not trying to replace humans and try and automate away their strengths within computers. If we continue this pursuit of AI where we're specifically trying to replicate human strengths, we will reach a point where not only are we going to increasingly have systems that are ultimately just automating away human decision-making, but allowing corporate executives or politicians to put aside the responsibility that they made in those decisions and say the machine did it, but also that we will increasingly live in a world where more and more humans will act like machines. So he was making those observations even back then. So this is, and we've seen many other scholars and STS scholars, especially science, technology, society scholars, continue to make these observations over the decades that increasingly not only is AI trying to replicate humans, but humans are starting to morph or merge into machines. And so I guess this goes to your first question of Weizenbaum, he was trying to show us back then that language is uniquely captivating. It is uniquely powerful in creating this mirage that there is something more than what actually is. And so all of these things around models being deceitful, models lying and things like that, I mean, that's exactly what he was talking about. We are ascribing intent to technologies that are ultimately just created by humans, and they're ultimately just spewing whatever, and it is us that are vulnerable to falling for that trap, not the models trying to deceive us. Yeah.
We'll go to the other side. Well, thank you for coming. A really informative talk. How would you characterize OpenAI's progress in AI today, if the choices are linear, logarithmic, or asymptotic? And how would you say they're marketing it?
Why didn't you say exponential?
You haven't gotten ChatGPT 5.0 yet.
Okay, fair enough. Specifically when it comes to research capabilities, I think it's asymptotic because they have started tapping out of their scaling paradigm. They have not been able to hit upon. So in my book, I got access to their 2021 research roadmap during my reporting, and even back then in 2021, they were like, we need to figure out something that comes after scaling because we are running out of runway on this scaling thing. And they still haven't figured out what comes next after scaling to continue pushing those research capabilities. And so they've now, and this is why GPT-5 hasn't come out yet. So now they've pivoted their strategy to focusing primarily on how can we wrap the models we already have in more and more compelling user interfaces, because ultimately they want to continue to dominate in the market and continue to capture more market share, but instead of competing based on research, they're competing based on interface.
I want to take the question, but could you speak to how they're marketing that versus like that realization? Like, do you think their narrative reflects that change?
No. Yeah, I think OpenAI still, I mean, all of the companies still try to position themselves as making rapid research capabilities progress, but that's not what's actually happening.
Yeah, in the back.
So I was writing on AI governance in 2019, and already then there was a big open source versus closed source debate, and I think it's gone quiet in the last 6 months, but I see that it could come back in the next 6 months. So I was wondering, part of how they found reasons to build that empire is because they're the good guy in the open source. If we leave that to democracy, basically, the open source is going to have massive consequences. And that hasn't really played out in the way we've seen models being deployed in the last year. So how do you see kind of that future of that conversation going and in that framework of empire of AI?
Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned as a feature of empire is the monopolization of knowledge production. And on the open versus closed source debate, I fall on we need things to be more open. And it's specifically because I think only when you have more open models do you start to erode the monopoly of knowledge production. The problem is that we don't have enough independent researchers cannot scrutinize these models. They cannot scrutinize the data sets. So the entire deep learning enterprise is based on this idea of test-train split. Your testing data and your training data have to be different. You cannot test your models on the same data that it was trained on. When you don't know what the models are being trained on, you cannot accurately evaluate whether the model is just memorizing what's in its data or actually developing new advancements in its capabilities. And so all of the evaluations of AI models today are totally bogus because these companies have not shown the data. So there is no ability to cross-check whether, you know, they say GPT-4 aced the LSAT. Was the LSAT in the training data? We don't know. And
yeah, you talk in the book about the meeting with Bill Gates when he saw for the first time ChatGPT 2 or 3, and it was like the best model that he'd ever seen, presentation, and you kind of question whether it was real because it aced the biology test or some SAT test.
Yeah, so Bill Gates issued this, Bill Gates was a key influencer in OpenAI getting more money from Microsoft. Even though he wasn't technically, you know, CEO anymore of Microsoft, he was still obviously, he had a lot of sway on Microsoft executives' opinions about whether or not they should deepen their partnership with OpenAI. And so initially he was very unimpressed with OpenAI's large language model development. He was like, these are machines that are just spewing language. So what? I want something that is going to be a scientific research assistant. That's when I think we will have generated true value out of AI development. And so OpenAI researchers took that as a challenge, and he specifically said, I will talk to you when you develop an AI model that can ace the AP biology exam. You get a 5 on the AP biology exam. And so OpenAI researchers took that as a challenge of, we're going to show to Bill Gates that we can develop this technology. And so they went and did all of this work to specifically get a model to ace the AP biology exam. And then Bill Gates was totally blown away when that happened. But was it trained on the AP biology exam? We don't know. Why did it ace, why it aced the AP biology exam is really crucial. If it aced it just because it was in the data, that is not nearly as impressive as if it aced it because it developed capabilities to do reasoning. And that's originally why Bill Gates chose the AP bio exam. He was like, bio requires reasoning. So this all of the, so to go back to your question, I do think that open source, the key aspect of open source is that independent researchers can then actually verify what these models are actually doing and can highlight the limitations of what these models have in ways that are independent of the empire's desire for what they want the knowledge in the world to say, So even if there are other harms that can come from open source, I do think the benefits of redistributing knowledge production away from the empire is so paramount to actually moving forward towards a better understanding of what these models can do and where they should be deployed.
Karen, thanks very much. Great talk. I'm curious what you think the public policy kind of approach to solving this issue will be, this issue of these vastly resourced, vastly powerful empires. I mean, we sit here at Stanford. Is there a kind of empire of academic AI that could counter? I'm not joking. I'm kind of serious, because if you look at what Princeton went and spent $9 million of its endowment to buy 350 NVIDIA chips. Same year, I think Facebook bought 350,000. It's kind of this massive mismatch. But if we want, I share your view of Silicon Valley's profit focus. It's always going to look for that first. But academia, public policy, this is exactly where we should be funding. And now I gather funding fundamental research is not exactly in vogue in Washington right now, but nevertheless, if we want a counter to this, an empire of academic AI would be perfect. People talk about a national compute resource. Is that something that you think we should be doing? And if not, if you were president tomorrow, what would you do?
By the way, Martin Giles, a former MIT Technology Review colleague, he was writing about OpenAI before I was writing about OpenAI. And I was the one reading his articles being like, wow, I want to write about this company too. I think yes, in that, I think government should, if it were in vogue, government should absolutely be funding a lot more research outside of the corporate empires. And that includes academia, but not just academia. It should also be in smaller nonprofits, smaller companies as well. And all different types of players. Also, not just funding the technical research, but resourcing human rights organizations or labor rights organizations or education organizations to also think about how they can participate in AI development. I think the thing that I wouldn't necessarily agree with in the way that you framed it is I don't necessarily think we should create yet another empire that's the good empire to counter the evil empire. I just don't believe in, but so like the way that I think about it is ideally we should be funding lots and lots and lots of organizations outside of the corporate empires that are all doing independent work, each with their own expertise, their positionalities, so that they can all contribute to the conversation rather than just create another monopoly of knowledge somewhere else.
I just elaborate on this question. So you mentioned that there had to be some public discussion on some certain issues beforehand or something. So currently the machine is already going, and there are plenty of things happening. And the discussion is happening right now here and other places, and so society is discussing that, right? So who should be leading this discussion? Like those employers, the society, the government, or maybe the smaller businesses? And what would be the role, what would be your recommendations for the smaller founders who are building, everyone is building right now AI, to probably step up and make it better?
I'm going to give a really annoying answer, but to me, the answer of who should be leading these discussions is everyone. You know, anyone who has any kind of say should be gathering spaces like this to have these discussions and then advancing that in the public domain. Like I was just, right before this, I was having lunch with a Stanford University undergraduate group that was thinking about how do we use student activism or student coalition building, movement building to also assert how we think that this technology should go. And I think that's exactly the right question to ask. It's like everyone should be asking within the spaces that I occupy, the institutions that I'm affiliated with, what are the mechanisms and levers that I can pull to contribute to the conversation? And you know, Stanford is so uniquely positioned in the sense that there are so many. You're right under the belly of the beast, and there is a lot of. This institution does have a lot of influence to shape the culture that ultimately creates these technologies. And, you know, like Anat was telling me how there's also, like professors they can be creating new courses to teach the way that technology can be developed responsibly. That could create a huge dramatic culture shift in ultimately the people who graduate from this institution and then become leaders of these companies. So there's so many different mechanisms by which I think that participation can happen. And it's more, I keep going back to this idea of there has to be a lot of it. It has to be coming from every corner, not just one institution, one leader, one group, whatever, leading the discussion.
And startups who are going for profits are the small startups that everyone is building AI. What they could do better in your, what recommendations would you give to them? Because they are going after profits as well. They're looking at OpenAI, and they want better for the success for themselves as well. So how would you recommend them to build their business?
Searching for, first of all, I don't think it would be good for their business to try and compete with these companies on large-scale AI models. AI startups would not have that kind of capital. They should, and so both from a business perspective and from a social responsibility perspective, they shouldn't be competing on that game. But what they can do is actually create new imaginations of what AI can do. I was just talking with a startup founder that was created a startup to focus on AI for material science discovery. And he is now specifically trying to innovate on that and show what is possible with more narrowly scoped AI systems dedicated to a specific part of the scientific process. And I thought that was awesome. There need to be more startups that are showing other types of AI tools that can be developed and contribute to ultimately what OpenAI likes to profess that is contributing to, like AI for science, AI for more resilient energy systems, AI for healthcare, things like that. I think that's what AI startups could do in this space.
I think, Annette, we are out of time, so thank you very much, Karen, for your time.
Thank you so much.